To look at him, you'd think that he wouldn't hurt a fly. With shoulder-length blonde wavy hair and pale blue eyes, he looks almost angelic. Driving his battered old yellow Volvo with surfboards strapped to the roof just added to the image of a harmless hippie-type surf bum. But don't be fooled. As they say, never judge a book by its cover. This is Martin Bryant, and on the 28th of April 1996, he entered the historic tourist site of Port Arthur and embarked upon one of the deadliest mass shooting rampages that the world had ever seen. Martin Bryant was born in May 1967 in Hobart, Tasmania, the first child of Carleen and Maurice Bryant. From an early age, Martin's mother Carleen suspected that there might be something wrong with her son. She remembers Martin had a habit of deliberately breaking his toys and described him as difficult and annoying. As a toddler, Martin would wander off so much that his mother was forced to attach him to the front porch with a leash to keep him safe. He was late in developing speech and he found it hard to make friends at school. Classmates called him Silly Martin, No Sense, and his nickname was The Shadow, due to his unnerving habit of creeping up behind people and leaping onto their backs. To him, this was probably just a game, a way of interacting with the other kids, but understandably, they found it annoying and they shunned him. To say that he was socially awkward would be putting it mildly. He seemingly showed little empathy towards anything or anyone and appeared to have learning difficulties. A psychological assessment of Martin at around age 14 described him as possibly schizophrenic, maybe also autistic, with a whole other raft of personality disorders. The ominous report stated, "Cannot read or write, mostly watches TV. Only his parents' efforts prevented further deterioration. His parents face a bleak future with him." In order to get young Martin away from the TV, Father Morris bought him an air rifle, which became one of his most treasured possessions. The boy took great delight in shooting birds in the back garden, and apparently he used to make sure that the birds were dead by repeatedly firing pellets into their lifeless bodies. He also took to firing at passing cars and randomly shooting at boats out in the harbour. His other hobby was spearfishing, which he practiced with his dad in Carnarvon Bay, just by the historic tourist site of Port Arthur. However, Martin lost probably his only friend he had at school after he pointed the loaded spear gun at the top of his friend's head and threatened to fire. Martin was removed from regular school due to his low IQ, his increasingly odd behaviour, and his lack of social normality. Martin finished school in 1983, leaving the special education facility at the age of 16. His parents, obviously worried about what the future held for him, had him assessed again. The report concluded that it would be very hard for Martin to hold down any real job due to his very low IQ, which was recorded as just 66, his difficulty in relating to people and reality, and his seemingly limitless ability to annoy and irritate those around him. He would most likely end up on a mental disability pension before he was 20. Having not much in the way of employment prospects or any friends, Martin spent his days roaming around the local neighbourhood, firing his air rifle at any dog which barked at him and glaring menacingly at anyone he felt had slighted him in any way. His father encouraged him to try and be productive and to earn some money by doing some odd jobs, mostly gardening and clearing brushland, and sometimes he went door to door selling homegrown vegetables. So, life was mundane but seemingly uneventful for Martin Bryant, and the next few years passed without many changes. But in 1988, a chance meeting was to set his life on a completely new tangent. One of his gardening jobs in Newtown took him to the house of 56-year-old Miss Helen Harvey, an eccentric lottery heiress who lived in a large run-down property which she shared with her elderly mother and around 50 dogs and cats. Yes, 50. Helen Harvey and Martin Bryant were both social outcasts with odd habits. Miss Harvey would buy expensive jewellery but never wear it, and she'd purchased over 30 brand new cars which she never drove. These two social misfits immediately formed a strong bond. Possibly the older woman was flattered by Bryant's attention, and in return she lavished money and gifts on him. Despite the inherited wealth, the two Harvey women lived in absolute squalor in the large house on Clare Street, Newtown. The 79-year-old mother, Hilza Harvey, in poor health and suffering from an undiagnosed broken hip, was increasingly left alone in the filthy house as Helen and Martin, now close companions, spent more and more time going out together, having expensive lunches and buying lots of new clothes. However, a concerned neighbour had filed a report to the local authorities about conditions inside the Harvey house, and medics duly arrived to assess the situation. They found a scene of filth and squalor, with the ailing Hilza sitting right in the middle of it. She was immediately admitted to hospital, but she died not long afterwards. The RSPCA arrived to take care of all the dogs and the cats which were roaming around the house, and a clean-up order was imposed on the dangerously filthy property. Bryant's father, Morris, took time off from work to clean up the house with Martin, a job which took 3 months to complete. Around this time, Martin Bryant was psychologically reassessed again due to the requirements of the social security system. The conclusion read, "Father protects him from any occasion which might upset him as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me he would like to go around shooting people. It would be unsafe to allow Martin to be out of his parents' control." This chilling assessment was duly attached to Martin's disability pension file and promptly forgotten about. For Father Morris, this was a very difficult time. He knew that his son was getting worse, not better, and he feared what the future might hold for him. He amended his will to give Martin the proceeds of his $250,000 pension fund, as he knew that his son would not cope with normal life and would need extra money to get by. By 1991, free from the ties of an elderly ailing mother, Helen Harvey had bought a small farmstead south of Hobart, and she moved in, along with Bryant and a new entourage of animals, including miniature horses and pet pigs. Bryant apparently had one favourite pig which lived in his bedroom with him, but it soiled the carpets so badly that they had to be renewed at least 3 times. Apart from cohabiting with a pig, Bryant's odd behaviour included dressing up as the country squire and roaming and prowling around the property at night, shooting his air rifle at the neighbours' dogs. Another annoying and potentially dangerous habit of Bryant's was grabbing the steering wheel of the car when Harvey was driving. For obvious reasons, Bryant had never gotten a driving licence, so he was always the passenger. But his childish habit of grabbing the wheel and trying to steer had already resulted in multiple accidents on lonely back roads. Helen Harvey wasn't amused and apparently told the neighbour, Barry Featherstone, "One of these days that little is going to kill me." However, seeing that Bryant had no understanding of how dangerous his actions were, she didn't end the relationship, but she did start to drive much more slowly. Nonetheless, in October 1992, the inevitable fatal car crash occurred. In a head-on collision with another car, Harvey was killed instantly, and Bryant suffered serious back and neck injuries. Bryant stated that Harvey had been distracted by the dogs they took everywhere with them, fighting in the back seat of the car. He told the police he had no idea how the accident happened, and upon being released from hospital, returned back to the family home to convalesce. Even during this period of recovery, it seemed that Bryant couldn't keep out of trouble. Incidents involving him around this time included being thrown off a bus due to inappropriate behaviour towards 2 schoolgirls and getting into trouble with the parents of some of the younger local kids after showing them pornographic material. In a somewhat surprising turn of events, it turned out that the ex-heiress, Helen Harvey, had left a significant chunk of her estate to Martin Bryant, 3 properties and cash of well over $500,000 Australian dollars. Bryant was now rich, a multi-millionaire in fact, although the bulk of the money had gone into a trust to be managed for him by his father Morris. However, once again, fate stepped in. A few months later, Martin watched as the body of his father Morris was pulled from the waters of the local dam. He had drowned, with Martin's lead diving belt wrapped around his neck. Rescue workers remember that Martin was very excited by the search, with all the vehicles and the flashing lights, but he seemed quite unconcerned by the death of his father. Morris had apparently become increasingly desperate and anxious over the preceding months. He was then taking antidepressants and becoming more withdrawn. A note in Morris's handwriting was found, so the police had no reason to suspect foul play. So Martin Bryant, a troubled man in his mid-20s, had just become rich beyond his comprehension. Now, this was undoubtedly a turning point in Bryant's life. He'd now lost his father's guiding hand, which was his only moral compass, and he'd lost his only real friend, Helen Harvey, the eccentric heiress. So, without any restraining influences and with an endless supply of cash, Bryant's strange behaviour began to escalate. He started dressing in garish attire. Sometimes it'd be a shiny grey suit with lizard skin shoes that were bright green, or he bought a bright electric blue suit with flared trousers and frilly dress shirt. He took to wearing a Panama hat, and he affected an English accent. But he was still friendless and an outcast. Chris Jackman, the owner of the North Hobart restaurant where Bryant regularly ate, recalled one scene. It was horrible. Everyone was laughing at him, even the customers. I felt suddenly quite sorry for him. I realised that this guy didn't really have any friends. He was like a child, trying to impress everybody. So to fill his days, Bryant began travelling a lot, taking scores of international and domestic flights, visiting mainland Australia, Japan, Singapore, the States, and Europe multiple times over the next 3 years. His main reason for doing this seems to have been the opportunity it afforded him to be in close contact with people. He would talk away for hours to whichever poor devil was sat next to him. Sometimes he boasted of his newfound wealth, but he was garrulous and overbearing. He alienated almost everyone he met due to his weirdly over-friendly and too intense approach. One woman passenger described him as sleazy and creepy. He was that kind of guy who, despite his looks, put people on edge. Back in Tasmania, during a break in his travelling, he met Janetta Hawani through his mother's church group. Bryant, as usual, tried to turn on the charm, but failed miserably. Janetta's mother warned her to keep away from him. However, the next time they met, Janetta saw Bryant in a different light. He looked so cool. He seemed so different, so in touch. He had long, blonde hair, blue eyes. He had huge muscles, and he was rich. I did like him a lot. It seemed that Bryant's weird charm had eventually won somebody over. They dated for around 8 months, but it wasn't to last. Bryant was just too strange and unpredictable. He had a thing for deviant pornography, which he brought back from Sweden after one of his trips to Europe, which Janetta found distasteful. The house he owned was full of teddy bears and dolls, and he would go around repeating a line from the horror movie Child's Play, which he watched repeatedly. "Don't F with the chalk," he would shout, and then giggle maniacally. He was by now drinking heavily as well. Bottles of Sambuca and Bailey's Irish Cream were consumed daily. The cool surfer image he had cultivated was just that, an image. Even though he had no licence, he cruised around in his beat-up Volvo estate with the surfboards on the roof, but they were unused, because Bryant couldn't really surf. But he still spent money extravagantly, splashing out thousands of dollars on diving equipment and a new dinghy. A trip out on Bryant's Zodiac dinghy was the final straw for Janetta. Bryant was dangerously racing them around the bay at top speed. She begged him to slow down, but he wouldn't listen. She recalls, "He'd go so fast, and you'd see a look in his eyes. It was like he was going insane. There was no fear, absolutely none." After the breakup with Janetta, it seems to have dawned on Bryant that no matter what he did, life was probably going to go on like it always had done, and he would remain essentially friendless and alone. Professor Peter Mullen, who has spoken to Bryant many times over the years, stated that Bryant admitted that around this time, feeling increasingly angry and bitter, he had decided that he was going to end it all. Unfortunately, Bryant saw TV coverage about the Dunblane massacre in Scotland, and he seems to have become obsessed with this event, the endless media coverage, and the intense speculation regarding the motive of the perpetrator, Thomas Hamilton. Bryant seems to have decided that if he was going to go out anyway, then why not try for some fame and take as many people with him as possible. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, Bryant began stocking up on guns and ammo. He bought a Colt AR-15 rifle, an FN FAL rifle, a 12-gauge shotgun, a couple of pistols, a combat knife, and a ton of ammo. Oh, and a big, strong bag to carry it all in. His chosen target was the Port Arthur historic site. He knew it well from his childhood days, and there were always lots of tourists there. The day began unusually early for Bryant, as he'd set his alarm clock for 6 a.m, something he rarely, if ever, did, as he had no job to go to. But today, he had a job to do. This was the big day, the day that he would do something that everybody will remember me by. After spending the early part of the morning performing seemingly mundane tasks like filling up the car with petrol, shopping for tomato sauce, and stopping for coffees, Bryant slowly made his way down to Port Arthur. The first stop for Bryant was the Seascape guest house owned by David and Nolene Martin. This was a property which Bryant's father Morris had unsuccessfully tried to purchase some years earlier, his bid losing out to the current owners. Bryant pulled up in his yellow Volvo, entered the house, whereupon he's thought to have killed both David and Nolene by stabbing them, tying them up, and then shooting them both at close range. As Bryant was getting ready to leave, a couple of potential guests arrived asking to see inside the guest house. Bryant said that his mum and dad owned it, but that they were out. He was quite rude and aggressive, and the couple left. For them, that was a very lucky escape. Bryant then locked up the guest house and drove off towards Port Arthur, taking the house keys with him. He stopped to chat to various people en route, including a couple whose car had broken down. He suggested that they go down to Port Arthur later on that day, as it was a nice cafe there, and he said that they'd be sure to enjoy it. Just after 1 p.m, Bryant arrived at Port Arthur. Now, his actions seemed to indicate that he was in two minds about what to do next. He queued up to get in, then he reversed his car to the back of the line, then he queued up again, and then this time he bought a ticket and went in. He went over and parked by the water's edge. The attendant told him to move his car to the car park, which he did, only then to move it back to the waterside again. He sat in the car for a while before finally shouldering his gun bag and entering the Broad Arrow Cafe to buy lunch. Survivor Ron Neander remembers, "This young bloke with long, blonde, surfy hair was standing right in front of us in the cafeteria line with his tray. He had a heavy, blue Rebel sports bag which kept slipping off his shoulder. I wondered what was in it that made it so heavy." Ron was shortly to find out. Bryant bought a big meal and sat out on the patio to eat it. He was waving his hands around in the air, and he commented several times about the number of wasps around and the lack of Japanese tourists that day. He was mumbling a lot to himself and seemed distracted. Having finished his meal, he went back inside the cafe. He returned his empty food tray, he stood by a corner table, he opened up his bag, and he pulled out the loaded AR-15 and opened fire into the small, crowded cafe.
What's your gun?
Where's the shotgun?
Stay inside, I'm pretty sure somebody's got a gun. No, in fact, you're bloody positive of it.
There's somebody going crazy, shooting people here.
In the bloody confusion which followed, Bryant seemed to have the luck of the devil on his side. This quote is from Wikipedia. Within 15 seconds he had fired 17 shots, killing 12 people and wounding 10. Bryant then walked to the other side of the shop and fired 12 more times, killing another 8 people while wounding 2. So in under a minute, Bryant had killed 20 innocent people and wounded another dozen. Most of those killed died from shots to the head. Bryant seemed unable to miss. He'd fired 29 shots from the 30-bullet magazine, and he left one in the chamber whilst he reloaded. Apparently this is in case somebody tries to rush you while you're swapping magazines. After a short pause to see if the coast was clear, Bryant left the cafe and headed towards the coach park area, again opening fire at panicked tourists and staff members who were scattering and running for cover. Over several terror-stricken minutes, Bryant chased and fired upon fleeing tourists, trapping one man on a coach. Bryant cornered him, whispered, "No one gets away from me," before shooting him in the neck. And although gravely wounded, this man amazingly survived. Having killed 4 tourists in the car park and wounded a further 6, Bryant got into his yellow Volvo and drove off, some eyewitnesses describing as waving goodbye as he left. But just 300 metres further on, Bryant slowed down when he saw a woman and 2 children running alongside the road. After pulling over slowly, as though he was offering to help, he got out of the Volvo and shot and killed Nanette Michak and her 2 daughters, Madeline 3 and Alana 6. Bryant then got back in his car and carried on up the road to the entrance gate. Here he found his way blocked by jammed cars. Once again he got out of his car and entered into a heated argument with one man about getting through the gate. Apparently no one here at the toll booth realised the gravity of what had just taken place down by the cafe. Tiring of the argument, Bryant grabbed his FAL rifle from the car and shot the man in the chest. He also killed the driver of the BMW who exited his vehicle to see what was happening, as well as killing the other 3 occupants of the car. Bryant now swapped cars. He abandoned the old Volvo and transferred most of his guns and ammo into the BMW, along with a can of fuel and some handcuffs. After dragging the bodies from the BMW and firing off a few more shots at some approaching vehicles, Bryant drove off in the stolen car. His next stop was at the service station just up the road, where he cut off a white Toyota which was trying to turn out into the road. Bryant, rifle in hand, forced the Toyota driver Graham Pears into the boot of the BMW. He then shot and killed the Toyota passenger, Zoe Hall. Now with a hostage, Bryant headed back towards the guest house. On the way there, he opened fire on any passing cars, managing to wound another 3 people in the process. Luckily, there were no fatalities, and the injured and frightened occupants were able to get away, making their way to a nearby pub, the Fox and Hound, where the owner called the police. Up until now, Bryant had been able to act without anyone opposing him. The only 2 armed police officers in the local area were not around when the shooting had begun. They'd both been called away to a remote headland further south by a hoax call reporting a stash of narcotics which had washed ashore. This all added to the confusion, and the 2 police officers seemed to have no real idea of what was going on or who was responsible. Finally receiving reports of injured people at the Fox and Hound, the 2 officers made their way there, and by around 2 in the afternoon they eventually arrived at the Seascape guest house. By now, Bryant had locked himself and hostage Graham Pears inside the house. Before entering, Bryant had set the BMW outside on fire. As the BMW exploded, Bryant saw the 2 cops outside and opened fire on them. The policeman hunkered down in a ditch, pinned down by Bryant, who occasionally took pot shots from the house. Australian news channels had by now gotten wind of a tragedy that was unfolding at Port Arthur and were ringing round the local businesses to try and find out what was going on. A reporter actually rang the Seascape guest house and Bryant answered, calling himself Jamie. When asked about what was happening, Bryant chillingly replied, "Lots of fun." He told her he had a hostage and would kill him if she called again. Now, I don't know if it was down to a lack of communication or local resources not being available, but it took an almost unbelievably long time for any police reinforcements to arrive. In fact, the police special operations group didn't turn up until around 9 o'clock that night. Now that's some 8 hours after Bryant had entered Port Arthur. At this point, the 2 pinned policemen were rescued from the ditch, and a tense standoff went on through the night. The police believed that there were probably 3 hostages inside. They didn't know that the owners, David and Nolene, were probably already dead, so a direct assault on the house was ruled out. Bryant, using the cordless phone, asked for a helicopter to take him for a ride to the airport, and strained negotiations continued through the night until Bryant's cordless phone ran out of power and the line went dead. At just after 8 the following morning, smoke was seen billowing from the windows of the house, and Bryant yelled for the cops to come and get me. The police were not to be lured out though, and they waited until the house was fully ablaze, at which point Bryant ran out, tearing off his burning clothes. He was arrested and taken to the hospital under heavy guard to be treated for burns. In the charred ruins of Seascape, police discovered the bodies of David and Nolene Martin and the hostage, Graham Pears. In his 18-hour killing spree, 28-year-old Martin Bryant had murdered 35 men, women and children and wounded a further 23. The Port Arthur Massacre was widely, but incorrectly, reported as the worst ever incident of mass murder involving a single gunman. Coming just 2 weeks after the Dunblane massacre, it shocked not only the island state of Tasmania, but the whole of Australia. Just 12 days after the massacre, Prime Minister John Howard introduced tough and sweeping gun control laws to effectively outlaw the ownership of firearms in Australia and Tasmania. Bryant soon recovered from his burns and was interviewed extensively by police and psychiatrists. Although diagnosed as suffering from Asperger's syndrome, he was declared sane and able to stand trial. Although initially claiming to be innocent and denying even being at Port Arthur on the day, Bryant's defence lawyer John Avery convinced him to spare everyone the embarrassment of a farcical trial and to just plead guilty. Bryant complied, writing down in his childish handwriting his damning confession. Bryant was sentenced to 35 life sentences and will never be released from prison. He spends almost all of his time alone. He's visited by his mother on occasion, but apparently he simply stares into the middle distance and refuses to speak. He rarely exercises, and his diet of pot noodles and bars of chocolate have caused him to balloon in weight. The prison officer who sees Bryant on a daily basis has stated, "There's no criminal mastermind here, just a dim-witted, obese slob." To this day, only Bryant's lawyer John Avery knows what motivated Martin Bryant to commit such a horrendous act of violence, but client privilege prevents him from speaking out. 10 years after the massacre, Avery said in an interview, "If I wasn't bound by client confidentiality, then I would, even if only as a historical record, release the files. I'm not suggesting that there is any big secret, but it is evident that the whole story has never been told." I remember at the time that this happened thinking, what a bizarre place for an incident like this to occur. Tasmania, nothing ever happens there. And Port Arthur, just looks like a beautiful, scenic, tranquil spot. It's absolutely the last place you'd expect something awful like this to happen. Now, while I was doing the research for this video, I came across the fact that there are a lot of people out there who basically don't believe that Bryant even did this, that the whole thing was a setup. I'm not going to go into it here because it's off into the rabbit hole of kind of conspiracy theory stuff, but I'm going to make a small video for it for my Patreons, which you can find over on my Patreon page. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.